Good evening, everyone. This is I Left Here Full and Have Returned Empty, Loss and Recovery in the Book of Ruth with Rabba, Wendy, Amsellem. And at the start of the Book of Ruth, Naomi suffers a series of profound losses. Her husband dies and then her sons. Even though her daughter-in-law Ruth swears her eternal loyalty to Naomi, Naomi is unmoved and reports upon her return to Bethlehem, I have left here full and returned empty. Using midrash and rabbinic exegesis, we will do a close reading of the Book of Ruth and explore how Naomi's understanding of family and relationships expands. We will consider what the Book of Ruth can teach us as our community confronts the terrible losses of this year. It is a pleasure to be learning again with Rabba Wendy Amsellem, who is a very familiar face at Drisha. We're glad to have her back. As she gets started, I will share sources for today in chat. And if you have questions, we want to hear them. Please feel welcome to ask questions in chat. I will bring them to Rabba Wendy's attention. That's on both Zoom and Facebook. If you are a participant, and I will be sending out invitations, you can also unmute yourself. And if you want me to unmute you, ask me in chat, use the raise icon, and I'm happy to do so. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabba Wendy.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kayla. Thanks. It's so fun to have such a wonderful moderator. Okay, so two things. One is before we get started, I just wanted to ask about next week. I was speaking with Kayla. If it's possible, I would prefer for our last class to start at 6 and end at 7 instead of starting at 6:15 and ending at 7:15. If that doesn't work for you, if you can just let Kayla know, that would be great. But if not, then we will plan to for next week to start at 6, end at 7. Sandra says it's okay. Amazing. Thumbs up. Fantastic. Okay. So if you remember where we left off last week, Naomi was in a really sad place, right? She had come back to Bethlehem, not because she had any sort of hope that her world would be better when she got there, but just basically because she kind of felt like she had nowhere else to go. She shows up. Everybody is very surprised to see her. They all say, Hazot Naomi. And her response is, no, I can't even be called by my own name anymore. I'm so different than I was when I left. When I left here, I was full. I had my husband, I had my sons, I had, things in my life to look forward to. And I've come back completely depleted, empty. Call me instead Mara. That will better reflect who I am, because my life is so bitter. And I think sort of the most painful moment is she says, the reason why my life is so bitter is because, if you remember in verses 21 and 22, she says, Ki hemar shaddai limod. God has treated me very bitterly. And then she says, right, Anim le'ah halachti v'rekam hashivani Hashem. I left here full. God brought me back empty. Don't call me Naomi. V'Hashem anavi v'shaddai herali. Right? God has tormented me and has dealt so badly with me. So I think it's not just the terrible things have happened to Naomi, but she feels about it that they have happened because God specifically has done bad things to her, right? And so I think that's why we feel about her that it's not just that things are bad for her, but she doesn't really have any hope at all, right? She feels like God has sort of singled her out for persecution. She doesn't have anything at all left. She's just this sort of depleted person. We saw very quickly at the end of our last class that midrash and Rabba that kind of describes what she used to wear this fancy clothing and fancy shoes, and now she's wearing rags and she's barefoot. She used to be so kind of healthy looking, and now she looks all sort of gaunt from hunger, right? There's a sense that she's sort of unrecognizable, both to the people in her town and also to herself, and that she doesn't really have very much hope that things are going to get better for her. And even though Ruth had just made that amazing sort of passionate speech of devotion, Naomi doesn't even really react to it at all, right? Remember, she just kind of stops talking to her. They keep going. When she gets back to her town, she doesn't introduce Ruth to anybody. She doesn't seem to sort of be factoring in at all. So that was where we left them at the end of chapter 1. Luckily for us, things are going to improve a bit in chapter 2. So if you look at source number 1 on the source sheets for tonight, here we're told, Ule Naomi modali isha. Naomi had a relative of her husband, Ish Gibor Chayil. He was a man of substance, right? A person, usually Gibor Chayil means sort of a wealthy person, right? He's a man of wealth, but it could also mean a man of valor, right? Either like a good, strong person or a wealthy person, or maybe all of those things. Mi mishpachat Elimelech, right? He's from the family of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, and the man's name is Boaz. Now, this verse is important to us for two reasons, right? One is that it kind of lets us know that in a few verses from now, when Boaz shows up, we'll already know who he is, which is like a useful biblical strategy, right? Sometimes at the beginning of a story, the Bible will tell us a detail that will then become relevant, right? If you remember in the famous chapter that describes the story of Hagar and Ishmael, the very first thing we're told is that Sarai has a maidservant named Hagar. And it doesn't seem to be connected to anything. But then a few verses later, when Sarai offers Hagar as a concubine to Abraham, then suddenly we know, why we were told about Hagar. And here as well, we start off almost as a non sequitur, hearing about Boaz. And it could be that we're being told about him because he's going to become important in a few verses. But I think also the fact that we're told about him in this first verse is significant in and of itself, because it lets us know that even though Naomi has relatives, they're not coming to seek her out, right? She has this relative of her husband, whose name is Boaz. Presumably, he's heard that Naomi came back to town because everybody seems to have heard about it, but he hasn't come looking for her. He hasn't come to help her. And there's no sense that he is kind of renewing his kinship bond with her. He's in town, she's in town, the narrator lets us know, but the very fact that there's no follow-up kind of lets us know also that he hasn't gone out of his way to find her, right? She's kind of still alone in her misery. Okay, then in verse 2, we're told, Vatomer Ruth Moavia el Naomi, Elchana hasadeh va'lakuta bashibulim, achar asher amtza chen beinav. So Ruth says to Naomi, I have a plan. I am going to go out to the fields and I'm going to collect the sheaves of grain from whoever kind of from the person in whose eyes I find favor, right? From whoever kind of will deal kindly with me. And Naomi says to her, Lechi biti, go my daughter. And so if you remember, she's also called Ruth my daughter in chapter 1 as well, right? It seems to be a term of affection, even when Naomi was trying to persuade Ruth and Orpah to leave her, she still called them, let's get the exact verse. She called them Shovna binotai lechna, right? Return my daughters. So it seems to be a term of endearment. She says it here again, l'chibiti. But I think it's interesting to spend a moment thinking about what it is that Ruth is proposing to do, right? So we know that according to the Torah, farmers had to give certain agricultural gifts to the poor. Among them was leket, right? Leket is that as the harvesters are harvesting, if one or two ears of barley, I guess in this case, fall, then they're not supposed to pick them up. The poor are allowed to get them. But if 3 or more fall, then the farmer is allowed to bend down and get them. So apparently the poor people would follow along behind the gleaners. And when 1 or 2 stalks of whatever they were harvesting would fall, they would sort of pick them up and they could keep them. But it sort of becomes clear from the chapter that creates kind of a bit of an adversarial relationship between the poor and between the gleaners, because the gleaners, when they drop things, it's kind of a mistake, right? They don't plan to drop them. And so if the poor are right there to pick them up, right, it almost makes the gleaners feel like, like whenever they make a mistake, like the poor are sort of benefiting from that. And so it becomes clear, we'll see in a few verses that often it seems that the gleaners were sort of subject to harassment. Sorry, the poor were subject to harassment by the gleaners because the poor were kind of underfoot trying to like benefit from whatever mistakes the gleaners were making. So we don't know if Ruth knows that this could be a dangerous thing to do, but it becomes clear throughout the chapter that Boaz and Naomi know that it could be dangerous for a woman to be going out there collecting leket. So that's one thing to know. Another thing that I think is really interesting, we at Yeshivat Maharat right now, we just finished a unit on Giur, on conversion. And the story of Ruth comes up a lot in conversion in terms of, we talked a little bit about it last week, the speech that Ruth makes to Naomi is seen as kind of a very important conversion narrative. But it also turns out that when the Gemara in Masachet Yevamot talks about the process by which converts are accepted into Judaism, we're told that we're supposed to teach the converts some mitzvot kalot and some mitzvot chamurot, some like very sort of important mitzvot, some of the lighter mitzvot. But the example that's given of the mitzvot that we're supposed to teach the convert, one of the main ones is leket. We're supposed to teach them about this this mitzvah of leket. And it's interesting to think about like why that would be so central, right? We would understand if like we were supposed to teach converts about Shabbat maybe, or about kashrut, right? But leket is sort of singled out by the Gemara and actually also by Masechet Gerim as something that we're supposed to tell converts about. Rashi also thinks it's kind of an unusual choice, and Rashi says, well, we don't want the converts to think that the poor are stealing when they come to get their leket, and so therefore we have to make sure that they know that it's like, it's okay, that this is what we do. So it seems that this mitzvah was understood to be sort of so central that a person who is contemplating becoming Jewish had to know about it right away. It also seems like it could be a little bit dangerous for the person doing it. And the one other thing I wanted to say about leket was that a number of years ago, I went to a very beautiful art exhibit. There used to be, I don't know if it still exists, but in Drisha's former location on 65th Street, there used to be a museum of biblical art a few blocks away. And one year they had an exhibit of kind of illuminated biblical texts. And they had both kind of ancient ones and modern ones. And they had a modern scroll of Ruth that was illustrated by an artist. And for some of the scenes, he kind of did sort of what seemed to be like sort of people in like period dress in the pictures. But for other ones, he had very sort of modern images. And his image of Ruth collecting leket was, I don't know if this happens in other cities quite as much, but in New York City, there's you can get 5 cents when you return a can for recycling, but many people in the city don't bother doing that. They'll just sort of throw their cans into the garbage. And there are people who will sort of come around and go through all of the trash in order to find the cans and then take them and return them. And you can sort of see, like if you go up and down Broadway, you can often see people with these big bags filled with cans that they have found, I would say almost harvested out of the garbages that they're going to take and return. And his image of Ruth doing leket was Ruth as this person kind of going around collecting the cans. And I thought it was actually a very apt image because I think the point seems to be that like the cans are like not right for many of us who are lucky enough to feel this way. The cans are like the 5 cent deposit isn't kind of worth the effort of returning it, right? It's like a small amount. We don't really care about it. We'd rather just throw it away than bring it back to the store. But for somebody else, it's like their entire sustenance can be brought, can be gotten from gathering together these cans. And I think also with leket, the sense is, dropping 1 or 2 stalks for the farmer, it kind of doesn't really matter so much one way or the other. Maybe the gleaners get a little annoyed when they drop them and other people take them, but like overall, like it's not an amount of money that really matters to the farmer, but it can be enough to sort of sustain Ruth and Naomi. So I thought it was a really lovely choice to kind of depict the modern day Ruth as a person kind of going through gathering up these cans to get the deposits. Okay, at any rate, Ruth has this plan. Naomi says, "L'chi biti," and then we're told, sorry guys, I'm just going to turn on the air conditioning again. It was a little loud, but now it's a little hot. If it gets too loud, you can let me know. Okay, so then in verse 3, we're told, "Vatilech vatavo vatilaket basadeh." So Ruth goes to gather up these sheaves in the field, acharei hakotrim, following behind the harvesters. It just so happens that she winds up in the field of Boaz. And now over here in verse 3, we're happy to know that we know who Boaz is, right? Verse 1, we were introduced to him, and now we have a sense of why it matters that it's Boaz's field, because Boaz is related to Naomi. And we're told again, Boaz, who was from the family of Elimelech. It is interesting, right? Because if we just found out about Boaz in verse 3, that would also work, right? In theory, we don't really need verse 1. We could just be told, like, she winds up in a field of Boaz, who is from Naomi's family. But I think once we're introduced to Boaz in verse 1, we're kind of waiting to see him again. So it sort of makes a little more sense. And I think it also, as I said before, kind of makes the point that Boaz is there, but he hasn't come sort of looking for them yet. Which we'll get to again next week, right? There's a way in which Boaz is very kind, but he's not necessarily, he doesn't sort of think to sort of be the person who goes out to find, goes out to make things happen. Okay, then we're told in verse 4, Boaz ba mi Bethlehem, right? Boaz comes from the city of Bethlehem out to his field, and he says to the gleaners, to the kotzrim, Hashem imachem, God be with you. And they say to him, Yivarechecha Adonai, right? They say back to him, God bless you. So if you look for 1 second at source number 2, this is a Mishnah in Masechet Brachot, the very last Mishnah. In fact, the Mishnah is very interested in this greeting between Boaz and his gleaners, right? Why are they all using God's name? That's not something that we usually see, right? Often people in Tanakh, when they greet each other, don't necessarily use God's name. Here it's sort of striking, right? He says to them, God be with you, using God's name. They respond, God bless you, also using God's name. And the Mishnah in Brachot, if you look at source number 2, says, right? One of the things that was established was that when people greet one another and they ask one another how they're doing, they can do it using God's name. As we know from the verse, Vayomer lekotzrim Adonai imachem, vayomru lo yivarechecha Adonai. Right? Our proof for the fact that we are allowed to use God's name in greeting comes from this moment where Boaz and his reapers greet one another. And the Mishnah in Brachot says that basically God is so invested in good relationships between people that God is happy to have God's name used in that way, right? We know that usually we're very careful about using God's name. We don't want to use God's name in vain. But God it's so important to God that people have good relationships with one another that God wants us to use God's name when we greet one another. Okay, so he greets them, and in fact, I believe that Sephardim, when they go up for an aliyah, they also repeat this exchange, right? The person who's getting the aliyah says Hashem imachem, and the rest of the people in the community say Yivarechecha Hashem, and then they go on with the rest of the aliyah, which is a very sweet thing to see. Gilana, did you just say something about that? Yeah, it's a good idea. It's a good question. And I think that I think we're just so hesitant to use God's name, right? There's a sense, right? The Mishnah's telling us, no, God really wants us to do this, but I think there's a sense that we are a little squeamish about it, and so we don't. Okay. Although actually elsewhere the Gemara says that Shalom is also a name of God, so perhaps in the end we really are doing it. Okay, so then in verse 5, we're told, Vayomer Boaz lana'aro hanitzav ala kotzarim lemi hana'ara hazo. So Boaz comes in, he surveys his field, he sees this woman here, right? Na'ara seems to indicate that she's a young woman, right? He sees a young woman and who looks unfamiliar, and he says, whose girl is that, right? Lemi hana'ara hazo, which is kind of an interesting question, right? Not who is she, but whose is she, right? The sense is that people belong to other people, and she connected to. And I think, there is a way in which this is sort of the central question of Megillat Ruth, right? Whose person is Ruth, right? Who is she? In the first chapter, Naomi said to her, you're not mine, you're not my daughter, go back to be with your mother. And Ruth was like, no, I am yours, I'm going to be with you always, right? And then Naomi kind of doesn't respond to that and sort of doesn't acknowledge that. So I think a big question throughout the book is going to be, to whom does Ruth belong, right? Who are her people? Who is her family, right? And it seems like she is trying to choose her people. She's trying to choose her family, but it's not always so clear whether they're choosing her back. So Boaz's question, I think, is not just kind of important in the moment because he wants to know who she is, but I think it's supposed to signal to us that it is a larger question of the book, right? Whose is she? What is she doing here? To whom does she belong? And the Na'ar, right, the worker who's with Boaz, says to him, kind of in an offhand way in verse 6, Nara Moaviyahi, right? Oh, she's just a Moabite girl. Hashava im Naomi miste Moab. She came back from Moab with Naomi, right? In other words, I don't know who she is, right? She's this Moabite girl. I don't even know her name. She doesn't seem to have any particular, right? The way he describes it, she doesn't even have a particular connection to Naomi, right? He doesn't say she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. He just says, oh, she's this Moabite girl. She sort of showed up with Naomi, look like the cat dragged in sort of situation. And then he goes on to say, Vatomer alakotana va'asafti va'amorim. She said to herself, I'll go out and I'll gather amongst the reapers. And so she came here early in the morning, and she's been at it. She has only rested just a little bit, which is either, it's hard to know sometimes when you're reading a text what the tone is, right? He's either sort of saying it admiringly, like she's a very diligent worker, she's rested almost not at all, or he's saying it maybe a little resentfully, like she's taking all of our stuff, right? She came here, she like is following around, getting the things that we've dropped. But it's not clear, right? He could be admiring, or it could be that he's a little bit resentful. But whatever it is, he's not very respectful, though. He doesn't know her name, right? He has no idea that her name is Ruth. He doesn't really know what she's doing there, right? She just kind of showed up with Naomi from Moab. And that's the extent of his identification of Ruth. But Boaz kind of wants to go further. So Boaz in verse 8 goes over to Ruth and says to her, hello, Shamat Biti. Have you not heard, my daughter? Don't go to any other fields. And also don't leave this field. Stay here with my women, right? There's a sense, again, we'll see this as the chapter unfolds, but there's a sense that it could be sort of dangerous for the women gleaning, right? If she's with the male reapers, they might harass her, they might be mean to her, they might molest her. And so he says to her, stay here with my maidservants, only glean in my fields. And then he says to her, in verse 9, he continues, right? You pay attention, see where my female harvesters are going to be gleaning, and follow those women around. And I've told my male reapers not to molest you, right? Stick with my female servants, and I've also told the male servants not to harass you. And if you get thirsty, you can go over here to our water vessels, and you can drink. You can drink the water that the men will drop, right? So basically, right, what is he offering her here? We had to like list it. What kinds of things has he offered her?
Safety.
Safety, great.
Water.
Water.
Yeah, safety and water, right? She is, and we'll see in a moment, Ruth is extremely grateful, right? In verse 10, she falls on her face. She bows down to him. She says to him, right? Why is it that you have even taken notice of me? I'm just a stranger, right? She's extremely grateful. And it feels like a moment where he's showing her kindness. But it always bothers me a little bit because I kind of feel like it's true that he's being kind to her, but he is actually offering her kind of the bare minimum that you could offer somebody and still be offering them something, right? He's offering her to sort of be free from molestation and that she can have some water, which are both great things, right? Everybody would like to be free from molestation. And if you're thirsty, you certainly want water. But like, I don't know, if like someone invited you to their home and they were like, come to my home, don't worry, I won't molest you and I'll give you some water, right? That doesn't sound like you're being offered that much, right? So we get the sense that Ruth's expectations are pretty low, right? Because she is so grateful, even just for these like kind of little morsels of kindness that he's throwing out to her. But it does kind of always feel to me like he's kind of offering her the very bare minimum over here. Now, other people read it differently. Other people will read this as like a great show of kindness. Stacey, it looks like maybe you're disagreeing with me. Are you disagreeing with me?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I think he's trying to like teach her the ways of the world. Like he's like, oh, you naive little Moabite woman, I don't really know who you are, but you have some connection to Naomi. I don't know what it is, and I'm not digging too deep. So I'm gonna make sure that nothing bad happens to you. I'm gonna teach you kind of the ways of the world. And he's kind of, I feel like trying to protect her. And there's something like kind of nice about it, especially because like her description is only that she's Moabite, which by definition, we're kind of like, ugh, Moabite, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, she definitely understands it as a great act of kindness. And it's certainly, I mean, it is totally an act of kindness. I would again just say though that like, I don't know, it just feels to me like it's hard to offer less than this, right? If he wants to offer anything at all, it's hard to offer less than we won't molest you and we'll give you some water. Sandra, please, what do you think?
I'm just trying to, can you hear me?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, great. How about the fact could it be a tiny wink to the fact that since we only know at this point, we know who she is, but all he really knows is that she's a Moabite working hard in his field, whether it's resentfully or generously, but so all we know is she's Moabite, and all we know about Moabites is that they turned Israel away didn't give them water,
Mhm.
didn't give them safety, kicked them in the behind as they're coming out of Mitzrayim. And in other words, did the bare opposite. So is that a tiny wink or a nod on the part of the Megillah's author, that what he's offering her may seem tiny,
Mhm.
but it's huge for an Israelite to go against the grain. You want to kick them back in the behind and carry forward the resentments that
Mhm.
Moab seeded in the Israelites, how many hundreds of 200-300 years ago. But in fact, he did not do that. So even though to us it may seem, oh, get a life, you know, you're the landowner, you could have done more than that.
Mhm.
But what he's doing is more than we think.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important reference that you're making, right? So Moab is famous in the Torah for not, right? Moab and Ammon are famous for not offering bread and water to the people of Israel in the desert, and that's why people of Israel are not supposed to marry people from Moab because of that. It is sort of interesting though, because if you remember in chapter 1, when there's a famine, Naomi and Elimelech and their sons go to Moab when there's a famine, and it seems like they're taken in there, right? It seems like they go there. We know that they lived there for 10 years. So it seems like even though Moab biblically didn't offer the people of Israel bread and water, in the time of famine, right, Elimelech and his family and Naomi go there, you know, in order to sort of find refuge from the famine. And it seems, you know, kind of seems to work for them. Well, honestly, we don't really know what happened to them there. We just know that they stay there for a while.
I always thought they bought their way in, and that was the point.
Yeah.
I mean, there was talk about the rechush,
Yeah.
that I got the impression, and reading the midrashim, that was sort of how it was. But then again, who knows?
Right. And I think, Joyce, you're making a good point also, right? Moab is Israel's enemy during this time. So showing even a little bit of kindness to one's enemy is very significant. That is totally true. Yeah, he's certainly offering her very valuable things. But again, as I was saying, like if a person wants to offer something, it's hard to offer less than this, right? Hard to offer less than water and freedom from molestation. Okay. But that's just it. That's their initial conversation. It is about to get a lot better, right? So Ruth is extremely grateful, right? She falls on her face. She thanks him profusely. And now in verse 11, we find out that really Boaz actually knows a lot more about her, right? He might not have been able to identify her, but he's heard a lot about her, right? So in verse 11, Boaz says to her, Vayan Boaz vayomarla, right? He answers her and he says to her, he says, actually, I've heard about everything that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband died, right? So the first thing that we know is that Boaz knows, right? He knows that Naomi has come back. He knows who Ruth is. He might not have been able to pick her out, you know, from a crowd. He had to ask like who that young woman is. But once he's told that she's the Moabite girl who came back with Naomi, he knows more about it, right? He has more information. He says, I've heard all about the things that you've done. I've heard about presumably your kindness to her. And I think even before we see the second half of the verse, I think right from the start, Boaz's description is very much kind of the opposite of the Na'ar's description in verses 6 and 7. Right? In 6 and 7, it was like, oh, she's just this Moabite girl. She showed up. I don't really know, like, you know, I don't know where she came from or who she's connected to. And now Boaz says to her, actually, you're part of a whole web of connections, right? You have a mother-in-law, right? You have Naomi. You have a husband who died, right? You are kind of intimately connected here with this community. Not only that, he goes on to say, you left behind your father and your mother and the land of your birth. And you came to a people that you had never met before, right? To an unknown people. So he is kind of taking her life story, her journey, and he is kind of recasting it in a different way, right? In a heroic way, right? She's not this like random Moabite woman who sort of showed up with Naomi. She instead is a person on a spiritual journey. And the way that we know that is because the language that Boaz uses to describe Ruth's life is very similar to the Avram language, right? If you remember in Parshat Lech Lecha, God says to Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetcha u'mibeit avicha, right? Go from your land, your birthplace, and your father's house, El ha'aretz asher eka, to the land that I will show you. And that is kind of the primary religious journey in the Torah, right? Avram leaving things that are familiar, leaving his family, going out into the unknown. And Boaz says to Ruth, you have done exactly the same thing, right? You left your land, your family, the place that you're from. You've come to this place that's totally unknown. And you are on this kind of powerful spiritual journey, just like Abraham, right? So first he tells her, I know that you're connected to people. You're not just here on your own. You're connected to your mother-in-law. You're connected to your deceased husband. And also you're here for a reason, right? You are on this, you're on a pilgrimage of sorts, just like Abraham. And then he goes even further. And in verse 12, he says, Yishalem Hashem pa'olech, right? May God reward all of your deeds. May God sort of give you sort of the full reward that is coming to you. The God of Israel, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to find shelter. So he says something very beautiful to her, right? He says to her, like, you're not this like schleppy person who just shows up kind of aimlessly. You are a woman on a mission. You're on a powerful religious mission. And I see that and God sees that, right? God sees that and God will reward you. And I think that's almost like the counterpoint to Naomi's feeling that God is personally persecuting her, right? Boaz, by contrast, is saying to Ruth, yes, God also notices you and God will give you your reward, right? You are doing something really wonderful and special. You deserve a reward. And I bless you that God will give it to you, right? Which is really a very, very nice speech, right? And is kind of, I think in terms of what we were saying before, right? What does Boaz know about Ruth? Seems like he knows quite a lot, right? He might not have known what she looked like, but he's heard her story. He knows all about her. He thinks that she's doing something really wonderful, and he gives her this very nice bracha. And I think it's also worth noting that even though Boaz knows all about Naomi and Ruth, he hasn't gone to find them, right? He hasn't gone to visit Naomi, right? There's been no previous encounter since Naomi came back. He knew that she was there. He knew all about Ruth. He didn't go to seek them out, but now that Ruth is there, he's treating her kindly. And I think I totally accept what other members of our class have said in terms of the value of the water and the freedom from molestation. But I think here he gives Ruth something that is really, really valuable, right? And because this is not just kind of the bare minimum that you can give somebody, what he's giving her now is a chance to kind of see herself in a different way, right? He's kind of reflecting her life experience back to her in a burnished, exalted way, right? He says to her, you're not just here because you have nowhere else to go. You're here because you are on a journey, and it is a journey that God will reward you for, which is really a beautiful bracha. And it turns out that Ruth is really taken with this also, right? So in verse 13, she says back to him, right? May I find favor in your eyes, sir, because you have comforted me. And you have spoken to my heart. And I'm not one of your maidservants. Okay, so I think a few things are worth noticing about verse 13, right? One of the things we were saying last week when we were reading chapter 1 is that in chapter 1, we know a lot about Naomi's state of mind, right? We know how sad she is. We know how bitter she is. We hear about how she has no hope, how she feels like God is persecuting her. We actually know zero about Ruth's like internal feelings, right? We know that Ruth is committing herself to being with Naomi all the time, but we don't know how she feels about anything, right? We don't know, is she sad? Is she not sad? Is she mourning her husband? Is she not, right? We don't know anything about what's going on inside of her. And the first time we hear something about Ruth's own feelings is here when she says to Boaz, you have comforted me and you have spoken to my heart, right? And that's our first indication that Ruth needed comforting, right? Up until now, we didn't really know how she was feeling. Was she just so excited to be with Naomi that nothing else mattered, right? We had no idea. But we find out from this verse that actually Ruth was in pain and she was very sad. And Boaz has spoken to her in a manner that has given her comfort. This happens also sometimes in the Torah, right? Sometimes we don't find out that someone is sad until we hear that they're comforted, and that lets us know that all along they've been sad, right? So one example of that is, if you remember, after Yitzchak marries Rivka, we're told that he finally, at that point, he has nechama for the death of his mother, right? And we had never known up until then that Yitzchak was mourning his mother, right? We had heard that Avraham has come, livkot l'sarava, lispod l'sarava livkota, right? Avraham comes to mourn and Sarah and to cry for her. We didn't hear anything about Yitzchak there, right? We didn't know how Yitzchak was feeling. We might have imagined, but the Torah doesn't tell us anything at all about it. And it's only when he marries Rivka later on that we hear that upon marrying Rivka, he finally finds comfort for the death of his mother, and that lets us know that he's kind of been mourning her all along. And here as well, right? We didn't really know how Ruth was feeling. We didn't know that she needed comfort until Boaz comforts her, and then she says, "Now you've comforted me." Now it could be that this is like a literary strategy, right? You know, we're sort of focusing on one part of the story. We're focusing on Naomi's state of mind and not Ruth's state of mind, so we only hear about it here. But I think there is also sometimes a way in which sometimes it can be hard for people to even acknowledge the pain that they're in until they find comfort, right? Somebody comforts them, somebody says exactly the right thing, and then suddenly they realize that actually they've been walking around with a lot of pain the whole time. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely true of sort of emotional or spiritual pain. I think it's even true of physical pain, right? Sometimes it's only like when a pain goes away that you're like, oh, actually my back was hurting all week. Now that it's not hurting, I remember what that feels like, right? So sometimes it, it's only upon the moment of relief that you can even really reflect back on the pain that came. So Ruth says to Boaz, "You have comforted me," right? "You've spoken to my heart." And then she says this kind of curious last phrase, right? "I'm not one of your maidservants." How do you guys understand that? I think it's a really curious phrase, right? That last couple of words in verse 13. "V'anochi lo ayeh kechat shifchotecha." What do you think she means there?
It's tough stuff.
She be, although it doesn't say that, I'm not sure of the word usage, the vocabulary. Could she be referring to the fact that she's not an Israelite? In other words, she didn't say, "I'm not your maidservant," but by saying, being a foreigner, because I mean, clearly she's not his household servant. I mean, that goes
Yeah.
without.
Right. She's saying, right, she does remember beforehand when she first responds to his offer of the water and the freedom from molestation, she says, "Anochi nochriya," right? "I'm a stranger, I'm a foreigner." So here she could be saying something similar, right? "I'm not one of you, I'm not one of your servants, I'm not one of your people. So it's especially nice maybe that you're being so kind to me," because maybe she assumes that somehow she's not as deserving of his kindness because she's a stranger, right? That could be. Can you
She's
say
an outsider.
Yeah, right. She's an outsider, right? So she could just be saying, like, "It's especially nice of you to be so kind to me, given that I'm an outsider," right? Maybe she expects that, that she wouldn't be treated as kindly, and she is. Can you think of, like, what else might it mean?
Wendy,
Yeah.
could it, is this where the midrash might pick up that that it's even more of a big deal that she's stooping down and gleaning for 10 hours in the sun? She isn't of a maidservant class. This is where maybe the midrash picks up that she was king of Moab's daughter and that she's actually a princess. And that in fact, when she told Naomi, "I will go and glean," there's a lot of talk among the Meforshim of whether or not Naomi was shocked. I mean, that this princess level girl should, for goodness sake, she has to literally and figuratively stoop so low as to glean in the field. So could it be? Do I think it's in her nature? Not necessarily, but it could be a veiled way of saying, "This isn't something I'm accustomed to. Thank you for letting me do this. I've never done it before. This isn't what I do."
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the phrase is, remember, right before she says, "V'chi dibarta alev shivchatecha," right? "You spoke to the heart of your maidservant." So she's referring to herself as a maidservant.
But I'm not what you think.
Not really. Yeah. So it could be like, I could read that, right? So she'd be saying, "You spoke to the heart of your maidservant. And by the way, just so you know, I don't usually." right?
I love it. I actually like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I see that Dara wrote here that Ehya is in the future tense, right? So Ehya could mean, right? It could mean I am not, right? In the sense of like I'm, the present perfect, right? I'm not now or in the future one of the maidservants. But I think there is a sense also that maybe what she's saying is she's hinting to him maybe that there is some sort of future for them, right? Anochi lo ayekech chipmotecha. I'm never going to be one of your maidservants, right? Either because I wasn't born part of the Jewish people, so I'm never just going to be like everybody else, or maybe what she's saying is like, maybe there's something to come in which I'm not going to be this way forever. It doesn't feel to me like that's the plain meaning of it, certainly, right? The plain meaning of it seems to be that she has no expectation of anything else from him. She's really grateful for whatever he's given her so far. And she seems, much like before when she says, why are you even noticing me? Anochi nochriya, right? Why are you bothering to take notice of me? Sounds like she's saying something similar here, right? You're being so kind to me. Even though I'm not one of this group. And I think that that's another part of the push and pull here, right? He says to her, I know that you've come to find refuge under the wings of our God, of the God of Israel, right? He basically is saying to her, I know that you're joining our people, right? That's your goal, right? This is kind of the language of conversion also, right? You're coming to take refuge with the God of Israel. So he's saying, I know that you kind of want to be one of us. And she seems to be saying, but I know that I'm really not one of you, right? And so therefore it's kind of especially kind of noteworthy that you're willing to be so kind to me. Would his maidservants be of a higher or lower social class than the people they knew? It's a really good question, Gilana. It's a good question because there was a sense, the rabbis often had a sense that like people's fortunes could rise and fall, right? So a person could have had a lot more money and then lost it and then found themselves gleaning, right? And that would certainly fit with what Sandra was saying about, a potentially like kind of royal birth for Ruth. But it could also be that like if you were the maidservant, you had a steady job and a steady income, and that if you were the gleaner, you didn't. So I think it's a little hard to tell from here. See, what did Kathy Bingham say? Yeah. I think it's hard to know, right? I think it's definitely worth noticing that Boaz clearly has heard that Ruth and Naomi have arrived. He hasn't gone out to greet them. Whether or not he should have is, I think, is an interesting question. Okay, so at any rate, she's very grateful, not just for the water and for the protection, but also that he has kind of said to her, sort of, I see you, I see what you're doing. I value it and God values it, right? Which is a really wonderful gift to give her. Okay, then in verse 14, it turns out that it's lunchtime, right? And so Boaz says to her, Le'eta ochel, at the time for eating the meal, Goshi halom, come over here, v'achalt min halechem, have some of our bread, v'tavalt pitech b'chometz, and you can dip your bread in the vinegar, right? Kind of like, for extra flavor. Vateshev mitzad kotzrim, and so Ruth kind of sits by the side of all the reapers. Vayitzbat lakali, he gives her some roasted grain. Vatochal vatisba vatotar. She has so much to eat that she herself is full, and she has some left over, right? Which is nice, right? They're being very generous with her. We find out afterwards that she immediately wraps up whatever she has left over and brings it home to Naomi, because throughout this book, Ruth is always thinking about Naomi, like even during this meal. Okay, then the verses continue, right? Meal is over, vatakom lelaket, she gets up to do more gleaning, and Boaz now turns to his male servants and says, Gam bein ha'omarim telaket v'lo tachlimima, right? Let her glean amongst all of the sheaves and don't shame her, right? Now, again, this gives us a sense that the, if he had not, he's only giving them this specific instruction because it seems like probably the gleaners did shame the poor, right? The gleaners are there to do their job. There are these people behind them, like anytime they drop something, they pick it up. So you get the sense that there's kind of a contentious relationship between the gleaners and the poor who are following along behind them. And so Boaz goes out of his way to say, don't humiliate her, don't shame her, let her keep gathering. Not only that, but in verse 16, he says, right? Drop some extra stalks her way, right? Let her go wherever she wants. Do not shame her. Don't give her a hard time. And also, go out of your way to drop a few extra stalks for her, right? Make it easier for her. Drop some extra stalks. Let her pick them up. The loti gariba, right? And don't scold her. Don't yell at her for doing so, right? So we get the sense both that Boaz wants to be kind to Ruth, and also that, like, you know, it was a little bit of a fraught situation. One thing that is interesting is that Boaz doesn't say, oh, hey, you're my relative, why don't you just take all this wheat home with you, right? He doesn't do that, right? He kind of leaves her in the position of the person who is gleaning, but he tries to make it easier for her, right? He says, give her some extra ones, you know, look out for her, don't shame her, right? So there's something interesting here with Boaz, right? He's like definitely being kind. He's definitely kind of saying the right things to Ruth, but he's also sort of not totally behaving as the relative that we might hope that he would, right? He doesn't go out to greet Naomi when she first comes back. He doesn't just give Ruth the wheat, right? He still makes her kind of go around and clean it, which I think is kind of interesting. And I think this sort of sense of Boaz as like being very good, but maybe not going all the way is the theme of one of my most favorite midrashim that is in Ruth Rabba. If you look at source number 3, we switch down to source number 3 for a moment because it's referring to this part of the story. Source number 3 in Ruth Rabba, we're told, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marion, ba hakatuv lelamdecha, she'im adam oseh mitzvah ya'asena belevav shalem. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marion says, look, the Torah comes to teach us that if you're going to do a mitzvah, you should do it belevav shalem. You should do it with your whole heart. How do we know this? Because he's going to quote a series of biblical figures who do good things, but if they had known kind of that we eventually in 2024 would be reading their stories, they would want to have done the thing that they were doing in a more full-hearted way. I'm going to turn off the air conditioning in the hopes that it'll get a little quieter. There we go. Okay, that is much quieter. Can you guys hear the difference when the air is on or not? Okay, well, that's good to know. I'm glad it's not bothering you. Okay, so, and here are his examples, right? Example number 1 was Reuven. Ilu haya Reuven yodea she'akadosh baruch hu machtiv alav vayishma Reuven vayatzilehu mi'adam vayomer lo nakenu nefesh. If only Reuven knew, right? If you remember when the brothers see Yosef approaching, some of them want to kill Yosef, and Reuven says, no, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a pit. Right? But if Reuven had known that we tonight would be reading his story and hearing Reuven say, no, don't kill Yosef, let's throw him in a pit, he wouldn't want to be known as the guy who said, throw him in the pit. He'd write, he would have saved Yosef with his full heart. He would have carried him home on his shoulders to his father, right? Because right, it's nice that we know that Reuven saves Yosef from being killed. That's certainly a good thing. But Reuven would probably prefer to be known not as the brother who had Yosef, who suggested throwing Yosef into the pit, but rather as the brother who like triumphantly carried Yosef home to his father. And Aaron also, right? If Aaron had known that God would say about him, "V'gam hinehu yotzei likratecha v'ra'acha v'samach belibo," when God tells Moshe, when you leave Midian and you go back to Egypt, your brother Aaron is going to see you and he's going to be happy in his heart to see you, right? Aaron, it's true, it's very good that Aaron is happy in his heart to see Moshe, but if he had known that we were going to be reading this verse, he would have gone out with an entire parade to meet Moshe, to show Moshe how excited he was, right? Wouldn't he want to be known as the brother who like welcomed Moshe with a parade, not just with being happy in his heart? And now we get to our Boaz example. Ve'ilu haya yodea Boaz she'akadosh baruch hu machtiv alav vayitzbat lakali vatochal vatispa vatotar. If Boaz had known that we were going to read his story, right, that God would have written about Boaz, that Boaz gives her this kind of roasted grain and she eats it and she's full and she has some left over, right? That's certainly a very kind thing for him to do. But would he really want to be known as the person who just gave roasted grain to Ruth? No, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marion says. He says, no, Boaz would like to be known as as the person who gave her agalot mefutamot haya machila. He would have fed her fatted calves, right? You know, if he's being generous, but imagine how generous he could have been, especially if he had known that we were going to be reading this story. Okay, and then the midrash concludes by saying, L'she'avar haya adam oseh mitzvah v'hanavi kotva. It used to be in biblical times, a person would do a mitzvah and the prophet would write down what they were doing. V'achshav keshe'adam oseh mitzvah mi kotva. But what about today, right? When we do good deeds today, who writes down our good deeds? Eliyahu kotva. Actually, there still is an account of what everybody's doing. Elijah the prophet writes it. Umelech HaMashiach v'Kadosh Baruch Hu chotem Eliyahu kotva umelech HaMashiach. So Eliyahu writes it, and also the Mashiach, and God chotem al yedehem, right? God sort of seals it after they write it. Hahud detema, as we know from the verse in Malachi, az nidbru yirei Hashem ish el reyehu, vayakshev Hashem vayishma, vayikatev sefer zikaron lefanav lirei Hashem ulechoshvei shemo. Right? So I think a couple of interesting things are happening in this midrash, right? One is, in terms of its reading of Boaz, right? The midrash is saying Boaz is certainly being very kind to Ruth, but he could have been even more full-heartedly kind to her, right? He's giving her good things. He's giving her water. He's giving her freedom from molestation. He's giving her these roasted grains of barley. So he's certainly being kind to her, but the midrash has the sense that if Boaz had known that we were going to read about what he was doing, he would have gone all out. He wouldn't have just given her the roasted grain. He would have given her, delicacies. He would have given her these fatted calves, just like Reuven and just like Aaron would have also kind of done what they were doing in a more full way. So I think that on one level, the midrash is kind of looking at Boaz approvingly, but saying like he could have done more. Right? He gives her something, but he could have done more. And I think that the second part of the midrash that I find really interesting is I think the midrash is saying we should all imagine ourselves as characters in a story that somebody else will tell. Because if we really thought of ourselves as characters in a story that somebody else would tell, we would behave differently, right? The good things that, right, I think something that's very interesting about this midrash is that it doesn't choose characters who are doing bad things, right? You might have thought like, oh, if, David had known that we would read his story, he never would have sinned with Bathsheba. Or, if Amsellem had known that we would read his story, he wouldn't have rebelled against his father, right? They're not choosing characters who are behaving negatively and saying they would have done it differently. The midrash is specifically choosing characters who are each doing something very good in that part of the story, but sort of imagining that they would have gone even further if they knew that we would be reading about it. And then the midrash, I think, concludes by saying all of our actions are still being written down. And so when we have the impulse to do something good, we should think like, what kind of story would we want somebody else to be telling about us right now? And then we should behave in the way that we would like to be read about if somebody else was reading our story, which feels like kind of an interesting breaking the fourth wall sort of moment in the midrash, right? Imagining, what would it mean to sort of, for each one of us to sort of imagine ourselves as a character in a book that somebody was reading, and like, what would we like that book to then say about us? Just as a second part of that. But getting back to our story in Ruth, right, there's a sense over here that Boaz is being very kind to her, but I think the midrash is suggesting maybe he could have done even more. Right? It's true that he tells them to drop extra sheaves of barley for her, but maybe he could have just given them to her. It's true that he gives her, roasted grain, but maybe he could have given her a better meal, right? At any rate, she, though, has no complaints, right? She continues to gather, and by the end of the day, we're told in verse 17, Vayihi ke'efas se'orim. She has quite a lot, right? Ke'efas se'orim is a lot for her to have gathered in one day. She comes back now in verse 18. Her mother-in-law sees all that she's gathered. And not only does Ruth give her all of the barley that she's gathered, but also she also takes out the leftover lunch, right? We didn't even know that she saved some lunch for Naomi, but we find out here that whatever she had left over after she was full, she saved to bring home to Naomi, because as I said before, throughout the book, Ruth is always thinking about Naomi. So she, of course, brings home her leftovers from lunch to share with Naomi as well. So Naomi now in verse 19, Naomi can tell that something is up, right? This is not the normal way that things happen, right? Normally when the poor go out to glean, they they have a rough time of it. And now it seems as if not only has Ruth not had a rough time of it, but somebody has shared lunch with her, and also somebody must have helped her, because a person on their own would not get a whole ephah's worth of barley in one day. So Naomi says to her in verse 19, "Ifo likata tayom," right? Where did you go today to glean? Va'ana asit, right? Where did you do all this? Yihi makirech baruch. Whoever recognized you and helped you out, may they be blessed. V'taged v'chamota et asher asta imo. So Ruth then tells her where she went. V'tomer shema ish asher asiti imo hayom Boaz. She says, actually, the guy who I was with was Boaz. Naomi now says to her, Baruch hu Hashem asher lo azav chasto et hachayim v'et hametim, right? Blessed be Boaz to God, God who has not forgotten God's mercy, neither to the living nor to the dead. And Naomi tells her, Karov lanu ha'ish migoalenu, right? Boaz is actually, he's close to us. He's one of our relatives. Now, I think this verse is very significant, right? Not just because it identifies Boaz as a potential redeemer, but also it's the first time that we have Naomi seeming to express kind of a shred of optimism, right? It's the first time that she says, oh, maybe God doesn't just have it in it for me, right? Maybe God really is remembering me with kindness, right? That's why she blesses Boaz and she says, God has not forgotten God's kindness, neither to the living nor to the dead, right? The fact that Ruth has sort of been treated kindly by Boaz, Naomi sees as kind of containing a kernel of potential goodness, right? There's something good that can come from this. It's the first suggestion that Naomi gives us that she might still be able to believe that God wants something good for her. Remember, throughout Perek Aleph, all she could say is that Hashem anabi, God has tormented me, God has treated me badly, God has brought me back with nothing. And now for the first moment, we start to see sort of a glimmer of hope on Naomi's part. She hears that it was Boaz, she sees how good Boaz was to Ruth, and she starts to kind of feel like, well, maybe something good actually could possibly be in store for us. Ruth then, kind of optimistically in verse 21 says, Gam ki amar alai im hana'arim asher li tidbakim adim kilu et kol hakatzir asher li. Oh, not only did he give me all this stuff today, Naomi, but just so you know, Boaz also told me to stay close to his na'arim, to his male servants, until they are done with their harvest. Now, is that really what Boaz said? Do you remember, what did Boaz tell her?
Stick with the Na'arot.
Right, stay with the Na'arot, im Na'arotai, right? Remember he had said to her, let's find it, right? Back in verse 9, right? He says, Enayich basadeh asher yiktzorun v'halacht acharehen. No, one verse up from there. He says in verse 8, Al telchi lilkot b'sadeh acher v'gam lo ta'vuri mizeh v'chot titbakin im na'arotai. Stay with my female servants. I think in Ruth's mind, it doesn't really matter, right? She doesn't kind of notice the difference, right? Male servants, female servants, either way, he just says to stay and harvest with her. But Naomi, who like Boaz, knows how dangerous it can be for the poor who are gleaning amongst the male reapers, the poor women who are gleaning amongst the male reapers, she understands that that's not what Boaz said, right? Boaz didn't say, stick close to my male reapers, right? She understands that that's not what Boaz says. So Naomi says back to her, Tov biti ki titzeim na'arotav. Oh yes, my daughter, that's the right thing to do. Stay with his female servants. V'lo yifka'u bach b'sadeh acher. And that way you won't be harmed or molested in another field. So by the end, right, it sort of becomes clear that both Boaz and Naomi know that this is a really dangerous thing to do, right? They know that to be a woman who is poor, who is amongst the male reapers, it's a very vulnerable place to be, and it's a place where, you know, the male reapers could shame the woman, they could harass or molest the woman. So Naomi knows that, right, when Ruth left that morning and she said she was going out into the fields to reap, Naomi knew that Ruth was doing something dangerous, and Boaz also knows that it could be dangerous, and they're both kind of trying to create a situation that will be less dangerous, right? They're telling her to stay with the female servants, and you get the sense that Ruth is kind of, I don't know if naive is the word, she doesn't seem to be as aware of the, you know, of how fraught the situation is. But she takes the advice of Naomi, and we're told in verse 23, "Vatidbach ben narot Boaz lelaket ad klot katsira so'rim u'katsira chitim." So she stays close to the maidservants of Boaz, and she gleans with them until both the barley harvest and the wheat harvest are done. And then after that, she stays home with her mother-in-law. That kind of gets us to the end of chapter 2. So with kind of the show of kindness that Boaz has to Ruth, we get the sense that Naomi can kind of start to imagine some sort of recovery, right? Something that could be better than where she is right now. But it's not clear what form that will take, right? It certainly seems better for Ruth to be with Boaz's maidservants than to be any other place, right? There's some protection for Ruth there. And it seems like she's able to bring back sort of a steady supply of food for herself and for Naomi. And that's also kind of a redemptive strain in the story. But by the end of verse 23, not that much has changed, right? She's still there with Naomi. They're still kind of, it seems like, living this sort of liminal existence where they're not kind of totally a part of the community again. It doesn't seem like they have any sort of security, but things are a little bit better, right? By the end of chapter 2, they're a little bit better than they were in chapter 1, both because they have a source of food and also I think because Naomi can start to imagine that it's possible that something could get better. And I think what we'll see hopefully next week is that the fact that Naomi can start to imagine a potential future that is better is going to be what enables that future to actually happen, right? If by the end of chapter 1, Naomi still couldn't imagine anything possibly ever working out for her again. By the end of chapter 2, she can sort of start to begin to imagine it. We see it when she blesses God, who hasn't forgotten God's kindness, neither for the living or for the dead, right? That's when she feels like it might be that God might still show her some kindness again. And we'll see at the beginning of chapter 3 next week, that's when it will really kind of take effect, right? That's when she will be able to sort of try to start a plan to kind of bring about a positive change for herself and for Ruth. Okay, let's stop here. As I said before, if next week, if we could start at 6 instead of at 6:15, that would be really great for me. If you have a problem with that, please let Kayla know. And if not, we will plan to meet at 6 next week. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just posting my email in chat for that
Thank you.
question.
Mhm.
Thank
And
you.
I will update everyone with if there is any time changes early next week.
Mhm.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
coming. Thank you for learning.
Thank you.
We have one class coming up tomorrow. Our discussions on the Parsha rotation this week with Rabbinic Leah Sarna. And with that, I want to wish everyone a good night, a good evening, and a happy counting down to the end of Sphera.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
And
you.
see you next week.